Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary was opened on August 11, 1934. Here are three of its most famous prisoners. My name is George Machine Gun Kelly, and I'm considered one of the most famous gangsters from the Prohibition era. I was born on July 18, 1895, to a wealthy family living in Memphis, Tennessee. After separating from my first wife, Geneva, I became a bootlegger with small-time gangster. I was arrested on several occasions for illegal trafficking, and soon after I adopted the new alias of George R. Kelly to help preserve the respect and name of my upstanding family back home. By 1927, I had already started to earn my reputation in the underground world as a seasoned gangster, having weathered several arrests and serving various jail sentences. In 1928, I was caught smuggling liquor into an Indian reserve and was sentenced to 3 years at Leavenworth Penitentiary. I served another long sentence for similar crimes in New Mexico in 1929. I moved to Oklahoma City, where I met a small-time bootlegger named Steve Anderson, and I soon fell for Anderson's mistress, Catherine Thorne. Catherine and I became inseparable, and as Catherine was also a seasoned criminal. We got married in 1930 in Minneapolis. Catherine had a lot of influence on me, as my crime sprees would launch me to the prestigious status of public enemy number one. Catherine was the one who purchased my first machine gun, and I would later be nicknamed for it, Machine Gun Kelly. People believe that Catherine was the mastermind behind several of the successful bank robberies I pulled off throughout Texas and Mississippi. In August of 1933, the FBI published wanted posters describing me as an expert machine gunner. In July 1933, Catherine and I set up a big scheme to kidnap a wealthy oil tycoon and businessman named Charles Urschel. We held Charles for ransom at $200,000. After splitting the ransom money with our accomplices, Catherine and I started state hopping, hoping to stay 2 steps ahead of law officials. We both dyed our hair to conceal our identities and enjoyed a lavish lifestyle. On the morning of September 26, 1933, Memphis police, along with FBI agents, surrounded the Titron house and then made a violent, forced entry. We were flown to Oklahoma, where we stood trial, and we both received life sentences. All of our accomplices were apprehended, and out of all those involved, 6 were issued life sentences. I was transferred to Leavenworth in Kansas, and Catherine was transferred to a federal prison in Cincinnati. I was arrogant towards prison officials and bragged to the press that I would escape. It was decided that these threats should be taken seriously, and in August of 1934, my accomplices Albert Bates and Harvey Bailey and I were transferred from Leavenworth by train to Alcatraz. Arriving on September 4th, 1934, we would be among the first group of prisoners. I became prisoner AZ number 117. My life at Alcatraz was largely uneventful. I had a job as an altar boy in the prison chapel, worked in the laundry, held an administrative role in the industry's office for a long period, and generally served out my time quietly. I shared a cell with inmate Willie Radke on the second tier of B block. I was returned to Leavenworth in 1951 and died of a heart attack on July 18, 1954. Ironically, it was my 59th birthday. Catherine was also released from prison in 1959 and took a job at an Oklahoma hospital as a bookkeeper.
My name is Al Capone, but I'm also known as Scarface. I was a 5 Points gang member. My mutually profitable relationship with Mayor William Hale Thompson and the city's police meant I seemed safe from law enforcement. I even made various donations and was viewed to many as a modern-day Robin Hood. But the Valentine's Day Massacre changed that, and I became public enemy number one. The federal authorities became intent on jailing me and prosecuted me in 1931 for tax evasion, and I got 11 years in federal prison. I then caught neurosyphilis, which is an infection of the central nervous system. I married Josephine Coughlin at age 19 on December 30th, 1918, and shortly after, Albert Francis Sonny Capone was born. I discovered that 3 of my men, Scalise, Anselim, and Guinta, were conspiring against me with a rival gangster. I beat the men with a baseball bat and then ordered my bodyguards to shoot them. On March 27, 1929, I was arrested by FBI agents and I was charged with contempt of court for feigning illness to avoid an earlier appearance. On May 16, 1929, I was arrested in Philadelphia for 1 year, PA, for carrying a concealed weapon. I was seen as a weak personality, and so out of my depth dealing with bullying fellow inmates that my cellmates, seasoned convict Reed Rudinsky, feared that I would have a breakdown. Rudinsky was formerly a small-time criminal associated with the Capone gang and found himself becoming a protector for me. The conspicuous protection of Rudinsky and other prisoners drew accusations from less friendly inmates and fueled suspicion that I was receiving special treatment. No solid evidence ever emerged, but it formed part of the rationale for moving me to the recently opened Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary off the coast of San Francisco. On June 23, 1936, I was stabbed and superficially wounded by James C. Lucas. At Alcatraz, my decline became increasingly evident as neurosyphilis progressively eroded my mental faculties. I spent the last of my sentence in the prison hospital, confused and disoriented. I completed my term at Alcatraz on January 6, 1939, and was transferred to the Federal Correctional Institution at Terminal Islands in California to serve out my sentence for contempt of court. After I was released from prison, I was referred to Johns Hopkins Hospital in Baltimore for the treatment of psoriasis. Hopkins refused to admit me based solely on my reputation, but Union Memorial Hospital accepted me. In 1946, my physician and a Baltimore psychiatrist performed examinations and concluded that I had the mentality of a 12-year-old child. On January 21, 1947, I had a stroke. I regained consciousness and started to improve, but contracted Brock pneumonia. I suffered a cardiac arrest on January 22nd, and on January 25th, surrounded by my family in my home, I died after my heart failed as a result of epilepsy. I was originally buried at Mount Olivet Cemetery in Chicago, but in 1950, my remains, along with those of my father and brother Salvatore, were moved to the Mount Carmel Cemetery in Hillside, Illinois.
My name is Robert Franklin Strode, and I was born on January 28, 1890. I'm known as one of the most notorious criminals in the United States. In 1909, I brutally murdered a bartender who had failed to pay a prostitute for whom I was pimping in Alaska for. After shooting the bartender to death, I took the man's wallet to ensure that the prostitute and I would receive compensation for her services. In 1911, I was convicted of manslaughter and was sent to serve my sentence out in McNeil Island, a federal penitentiary in Washington state. My record at McNeil indicates that I was violent and difficult to manage. On one occasion, I viciously assaulted a hospital orderly who had insisted on reporting me to the administration for attempting to procure narcotics through intimidation and threats. On another occasion, I stabbed a fellow inmate. Shortly after receiving an additional 6-month sentence for my hostile actions, I was transferred to Leavenworth Federal Penitentiary in Kansas due to ceaseless complaints about my threats towards other inmates and also because of overcrowding in the prison. In 1916, after I was refused a visit with my brother, I stabbed a guard to death in front of 1,100 inmates in the prison mess hall. I was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to death by hanging, and I was ordered to await my death sentence in solitary confinement. My mother desperately pleaded for my life, and finally in 1920, President Woodrow Wilson commuted my death sentence to life imprisonment without parole. As a result of my unpredictable and violent outbursts, Warden T.W. Morgan directed that I should be permanently placed in the segregation unit to live out my sentence in total solitude. Over the course of my 30 years of imprisonment at Leavenworth, I developed a keen interest in canneries. After finding an injured bird in the recreation yard, I was initially allowed to breed birds and maintain a lab inside 2 adjoined segregation cells, since it was felt that this activity would provide for productive use of my time. As a result of this privilege, I was able to author 2 books on canneries and their diseases, having raised nearly 300 birds in my cell. I even developed and marketed medicines for various bird ailments. Although it is widely debated whether the remedies I developed were effective, I was able to make scientific observations that would later benefit research on the canary species. However, after several years of my informal research, prison officials discovered that some of my equipment I had requested was being used to construct a still to make an alcohol brew. In 1942, I was transferred to Alcatraz, where I spent the next 17 years in segregation in D Block and 11 years in the prison hospital. In 1959, I was transferred to the Medical Center for Federal Prisoners in Springfield, Missouri, and there on November 21st, 1963, I was found dead from natural causes.